Okay, so this will be the second part of week five's topics, which deal with deviance, both formal and informal social control. And today we're going to talk about specifically crime, law, and then we're going to talk about theories of deviance using those three sort of perspectives or themes in sociological theory to look at the different ways that sociologists approach this issue of deviance in their research. The reading, as you can see here, is the reading Total Confinement. We'll come back to that later. Make a point now. If you notice in the second paragraph, it talks about the irrationality of technically rational systems. You might remember that being a George Ritzer concept from McDonaldization. So we're going to talk about that. But anyway, so last time we ended by talking about, we made the distinction between informal and formal social control, with formal social control being carried out by authorized agents or in positions of authority, and informal social control as efforts of social control that come from other places, essentially. Could be peer groups, family, and even the physical environment itself, as we saw with Disney World. So today we're going to think about, again, like I said, certain types of social control as it relates to certain, and specifically when it comes to the law, and which necessarily means when we talk about the law, we're going to be talking about crime, right? The law decides and the law dictates what is considered a crime and what is not considered a crime, and also how that's handled. And then we're going to talk about different theories of deviance. We're going to talk about how deviance and how society decides who is deviant and who is not in different situations. So to talk about law, though, recall when we talked about norms. Norms are what people deviate from. When we talk about deviance, they're deviating from norms. And norms are what is encouraged or enforced using social control. Certain norms are sort of seen as so important in society that they're codified into law. That we have laws, right? They're norms that are important enough to be formalized. And the law also then represents a form of governmental social control, right? It makes the law about a certain norm, and that law gives them the ability to exercise authority in enforcing compliance to that norm. So we could think about laws. It's a huge area. Laws that can be aimed at individuals, or rather, there are laws that apply to everybody. For instance, laws against murder, laws that apply to specific groups, so fishing licenses, and even laws that apply to social institutions, so like corporate laws about the conduct of business, the conduct of banks. So you're think about how it is that how does law get made? And I don't really mean the civics of it, like how a bill becomes a law, but rather like what is the sort of social process of a law being made? Why do we have laws against certain behaviors? We think about the 18th Amendment, the prohibition, when this country made alcohol illegal for a certain period of time. That law got made because certain groups of citizens sort of felt that the alcohol consumption was doing bad things to American society and was causing a lot of problems. So they pushed for the creation of this law. What I'm trying to get at here is that laws are created simply by people sort of thinking about that something needs to be controlled, that people aren't following certain norms, or not everyone is following these norms like we'd want them to, so we should make a formal rule about it. In this way, we can think about sociology unanimously agrees that laws and the legal order in any society reflects the values of those who are in a position to exercise authority, those in a position of power, which makes sense. If you are able to make law, it's likely that the law was going to reflect sort of your view of how society should work. And it makes sense that those who are not able to exercise that sort of authority are not going to get their sort of views represented by the law. Sorry, that's my dog. But in thinking about law and how the sort of things that we find legal orders exercising authority around, I can also ask the question, do laws always work? That is, do legal sanctions, threats of fines, prison, other things, always work? I gave the example last time about college binge drinking. There are formalized laws about underage drinking and also just drinking on campuses, both from the state and from the school itself. But people still engage in it, right? There may be, there are varying laws around the use of marijuana, and we know that support is, well above half the country supports it, and many people still engage in it despite the laws that exist in any given state or by the federal government totally. But, we have laws against murder. Is that why people don't murder people? Because there's a law? I think have you ever murdered anyone? And is it because that there's a law against it? And if you thought, well, I would do it, but there's a law, so I probably shouldn't, right? There's this idea when we think about certain ideas in sociology about sort of the function of law in society and as it relates to sort of obedience, called control theory, which is really thinking about the sort of dynamics of social control. The argument here is that obedience, so not murdering somebody, is actually more tied to our socialization process and our desire to belong than it is the actual threats of exercising authority. So that is, we don't murder people because we were socialized into sort of social norms that this is a bad thing to do, and that we would experience maybe even shunning from those around us. The power of our socialization is stronger than the law itself, which would explain things like the college binge drinking, that the power of the encouragement to drink is actually stronger than the law telling kids not to drink. We can also think prohibition, or again marijuana, that the laws falter because there's not a lot of social consensus, meaning people's ability to belong to groups, certain groups, is not tied to breaking this norm. If your friends do it, or if your family does it, or it's in your social world, it's not as big of a deal. And so the law, sort of relative power, seems almost weak in the face of the influence of our family and friends. So one question that arises of this is, how do we justify harsh criminal penalties with the idea that the sanctions will discourage people from deviating? But another question arises then is, well, if why do then people deviate? If we primarily follow norms out of a sense of belonging, which is usually stronger than the fear of punishment, then why do people engage in deviant behavior at all? If you potentially face disapproval from, or even a loss of friends, let alone imprisonment, why does deviance occur? Why do people deviate from expected, social norms in any given situation, not just criminal stuff? So that's what we're going to talk about now, which is sort of theoretical approaches to the question of deviance by sociologists. I've given an example before. We're going to use those three themes that we talked about. We'll come back to crime, actually. Whoops. Functionalist, interactionist, and conflict theory. Remember, these are themes or schools of theory that offer us different perspectives on the exact same sort of issue, which is here deviance, crime, law. So the first one we're going to talk about was functionalist. And again, this was the one that sort of has a biological metaphor. Parts of society work together in order to promote stability. So early functionalist theories about deviance, why people deviate. And first, it's important to note that when it comes to deviance across the board, sociologists reject any explanation that's based on biological, genetic factors, which was a leading argument in popular thought in the 20th century. So people are not predisposed to, engaging in certain behaviors. That it is a social phenomenon. So functionalists look at deviance in terms of how, in terms of stability. For functionalists, they can see that deviance can have both positive and negative consequences for social stability. So the kid who sees one parent scold another for bad dinner manners in a given situation, right? The deviance of that parent in that moment actually can promote stability because the child in its socialization is witnessing the sort of boundaries of what's considered acceptable. And their parent sort of being scolded by the other one, right, sort of sets this up for them. They can see sort of like the limits of what should be happening. So similarly, the control mechanisms or punishments around deviance are also important. Durkheim viewed social control as the mechanisms that are necessary to define what's acceptable within a given society. We need the punishments because, imagine, without them, there would be sort of not a lot of limits on people's behavior. We would have no way of knowing how to act. And in theory, I guess everybody would just sort of be acting in their own interest at every single given moment. So I mentioned before when we talked about suicide in Durkheim a long time ago, this word anomic or anomy came up. Durkheim thought that this was so important, that these punishments around deviance are so important for stability, about just defining what's acceptable, that he argued when these sort of disappear, that when an individual in society the social control in that society falls apart, that control of individual behavior becomes ineffective, that it actually leads people to feel sort of lost. That without any sort of messages about how we should be behaving and control of our behavior, sort of giving us at least a certain amount of direction, giving us control about what sort of values are worth pursuing, etc., that we actually sort of feel a really significant loss of direction. And he argued that this was tied to an increase in suicide. But this question of anomy actually gets to the question was like, well, why do people accept or reject the goals of society? Again, so why would people reject the standards of acceptable behavior if they are supposed to be helping stability? This guy, Robert Merton, came up with this notion, the anomy theory of deviance. I'm going to ask before, what does like a SEPTA driver driving the trolley and a drug dealer on the corner, what do they have in common? They're both trying to make money, right? They have the same objective, they just have a different approach. And you notice here these different conformist, innovator, ritualist, retreatist. Merton talked about that in a culture, for instance, in this SEPTA driver drug dealer example, in a culture that values success as money, the teacher and the drug dealer share the same aspirations. However, it is in this society that the labels or the activities, driving the trolley and selling drugs, that one is considered deviant and the other is not. That is a socially constructed sort of valuation of those two activities. But what's important to recognize is that they're both trying to sort of accomplish the same goal. That, again, deviance is a socially created idea, not pathological. People don't sort of deviate because they are pathological in any way, that they're both trying to achieve a certain goal, a certain value that also exists in our culture. And it's really just the sort of relative power of the law in sort of discouraging selling drugs that is worth analyzing, not the individual sort of being, a pathological person. So we're still asked this question, though. We still kind of, we can see here how rule violation may happen despite control, right? So goal attainment, so somebody trying to just make money. It doesn't really tell us how an individual person comes to commit deviant acts or why deviance does not occur or does occur in different situations, right? So why the drug dealer and not the SEPTA driver? So interactionist theory actually helps us get to this because we're going to be very sort of close to the ground. Interaction, right? Microsociology. So the first sort of one interactionist theory tied to deviance is this idea of cultural transmission. It's sort of like what it sounds like. That cultural transmission, that humans learn to behave in certain social situations, whether it's proper or improper, through the sort of cultural cues around them. So kids learn to hit at school. They may go home and start hitting even if their families don't promote that sort of thing. The idea here is differential association, that the process through which exposure to attitudes that are favorable to acts that are considered criminal leads to a violation of the rules. So what the idea here is if you grow up in a situation or you are socialized in a situation where certain behaviors that society has labeled as criminal or illegal, however, if in your cultural upbringing it is sort of not seen as that way, it doesn't carry the same sort of weight as being bad, then you may not associate, right? You have a differential association of the act and its criminality. attitudes, if you're surrounded by people who have favorable attitudes to an act that is considered criminal, it seems less consequential to violate the rules. This is essentially how peer pressure works, right? To engage in criminal behavior. That those around you, peers, more important than the sort of abstract idea of the law, sort of encourage, and not that they force you, but you're surrounded by views of the act that aren't bad, then it makes sense that you might too come to see that. Whether a person engages in an activity deemed improper or improper then depends on the frequency and duration of the two types of social interaction, those that are endorsing the deviant behavior and those that are promoting the acceptance of the norms and not deviating. So people are more apt to engage in norm-defying behavior if they belong to a group or subculture that stresses deviant values. Again, this sort of makes sense. This idea was kind of turned on its head and then picked up on with the development of social disorganization theory. And this later was called broken windows theory. We'll talk about that in a second. This is sort of an extension of that earlier idea. The idea of social disorganization is that in areas or in situations where there is greater social disorganization, you are also going to see a greater rate of deviance and crime, or crime specifically and deviance more generally. The idea is that the power of the sort of social control, both informal and formal, weakens, and so deviance almost loses its cost, and it also signals to people that rules aren't so much applying. So this was turned into by two authors into this idea of broken windows theory. There's a video for this, and I want you to watch that. And then we'll come back and talk about broken windows theory.
A broken window.
In his classic work, Thinking About Crime, renowned social scientist James Q. Wilson observed that disorder and crime are usually inextricably linked, that human behavior is profoundly affected by its environment. Broken windows, graffiti, drunkenness, and open displays of unfettered sexuality are an invitation for crime, a declaration that the environment is uncontrolled and uncontrollable, and that anyone can invade it to do whatever damage and mischief the mind suggests. Almost like clockwork, when this broken window effect is reversed and these elements are removed or suppressed within a community, crime rates plummet. An ordered and more dignified atmosphere encourages civility and moral behavior, while disorder breeds anarchy and immorality.
Hi, how you doing?
On July 17, 2014, New York City police officer Daniel Pantaleo choked an African-American grandfather named Eric Garner to death. Before Pantaleo killed him, Garner said, "Every time you see me, you want to harass me. You want me to stop selling cigarettes." Garner's widow, Esau, told NBC that police harassed Garner constantly. Garner had 30 arrests since 1980, several for selling loose cigarettes. In 2007, while in Rikers Island, Garner hand-wrote a federal lawsuit accusing police of sexually assaulting him during a search in the middle of the street. A policing tactic called broken windows may have led to Garner's death at the hands of the police. Social scientists James Wilson and George Kelling introduced the broken windows theory in 1982 in an article in the Atlantic Monthly. According to Kelling and Wilson, if a neighborhood had a broken window, residents would break other windows. Soon, crime would soar. All because no one pushed back against the first signs of quote-unquote disorder. 8 years after Wilson and Kelling published Broken Windows, William Bratton became police commissioner of New York City. He began to apply their theory to the city. He introduced a zero-tolerance policy for misdemeanors like subway graffiti, turnstile jumping, or jaywalking. Under his leadership, a New Yorker could be arrested for selling art on the street. The idea was that police would find folks who had outstanding warrants and prevent bigger crimes from being committed. Let's be clear, broken windows policing doesn't mean cops will fix up poor neighborhoods. It means they'll arrest poor people. It only focuses on crimes done by the powerless. And it's really about controlling communities of color, arresting people for minor or non-existent crimes, then funneling them through courts and prisons. There is no evidence that broken windows policing makes communities safer. Being searched and questioned by police is intrusive and demeaning. Over 80% of those stopped and frisked are Latino or Black. These stops are far from polite. In 2011, a Harlem teenager recorded police calling him a fucking mutt when he asked why they threatened to arrest him. "Dude, I'm gonna break your fucking arm," one officer said. On January 19th, 2014, NYPD officers beat 84-year-old Kang Wong bloody just for jaywalking. He was crossing the street too slowly. He's still traumatized, Wong's son told the New York Daily News a week after the arrest. In July 2014, an NYPD officer choked Roseanne Miller, who was pregnant at the time, after confronting her about having a family barbecue on the sidewalk. Unsurprisingly, some interactions with police end in death. In November 2014, Akai Gurley was walking with his girlfriend down the stairwell of her apartment building in Brooklyn. Without warning, a cop shot him dead. Officer Peter Lang was pointing his gun randomly, finger on the trigger. He claims he shot Gurley by accident. As Gurley died, Lang texted his union. In 2013, New York Mayor Bill de Blasio ran on a platform opposing stop and frisk. But in 2014, he reappointed William Bratton as chief of police. The officers on Bratton's force still harass Black and brown communities. They still target the small infractions that make New York, New York. Subway acrobats, loud music at the West Indian Day Parade. They still kill people. Like Akai Gurley. Like Eric Garner. On December 3rd, a Staten Island grand jury declined to indict Garner's killer. In the following days, protesters shut down bridges in New York. Before Garner died, he told police, "This stops today." The protesters intend to keep his promise.
So we see here these authors were arguing that there are higher rates of social problems as a result of deviance and then crime in areas with deteriorating buildings, literally broken windows. That what ends up happening is there's a sense of social disorder that leads people to sort of step away or downplay the power of the social control that is represented through, I guess, not having broken windows. But as that video sort of suggested, we can maybe see some problems with this. First of all, there is no data to suggest that actually turning this idea into a policing strategy works at all. There's zero data to prove this. Social scientists have spent a lot of time studying broken windows theory because it's been around for a long time, and there is very little data to support it. So in a theoretical sense, the idea of broken windows maybe makes sense, but in a sort of applied way on the street, it doesn't really make sense. And we can think about why it doesn't work, and this idea of blaming the victim, or why it broken windows policing disproportionately affects certain communities, particularly communities of color. We can think of it as blaming the victim for the broken windows in some ways, that it possibly ignores larger social forces. So think about the broken windows. Who broke the windows in a metaphorical sense? Is it the people who are then going and get arrested? People who live in an environment? When they talk about broken windows, they mean something much larger than that. They mean broad. The windows get broken by broad social forces. The economy, right? A lack of jobs, the declining infrastructure, which means a decline in sort of home ownership or even the occupancy of certain buildings, which means they're going to deteriorate. Poor services from the city in order to take care of the areas, right? Lack of good schools, right? These are all examples of social disorganization, right? But that is not the fault of the people who were there. These are large social structures sort of creating these situations. Further, broken windows theory totally ignores, by focusing on the windows, it ignores viable and healthy relationships into institutions that do exist in so-called troubled neighborhoods, right? And that it focuses entirely on almost like sort of surface phenomenon, almost going after the symptom rather than the cause. So the next interactionist theory that we can look at that deals with deviance is powerful, and we're going to talk about this a couple times, especially when we deal with the media, is labeling theory. This is a big one, so make sure you sort of feel clear on this. Labeling theory sort of steps back from this whole problem that we're talking about. And really what it's trying to explain is why it is that some people are viewed as deviants while others are not viewed as deviant. How can we... So white teenagers in the suburbs who do and sell drugs versus non-white teenagers who do the same thing in urban areas. Data shows they are treated very, very, very differently by the police. If we, the question here is like the same act, why are some acts called deviant and some not? The basis for thinking through this is just to start with that the only way we can define deviant behavior is behavior that's labeled deviant. That is the purest definition, right? Because it allows us to be relative in our situations, right? That the issue isn't whether or not something is or isn't sort of as it would be, decided by, written in the stars. It's the question becomes, why is this being labeled deviant? So here it's the response to the act and not the act itself that determines deviance. It is not the act, it's the response, which is culturally conditioned. So we have the bus driver and the drug dealer both trying to make money, right? It is the social response and the sort of social codes that exist around drug dealing versus driving a bus, right? That determines that one is deviant and one is not the behavior itself. Because, for instance, selling marijuana, if there were no drug laws, right, there would not be a response to that act, selling those on the corner, and so it would not be considered deviant. The acts could both continue. They would both be the same. What this shows us is that deviance, what counts as deviance, ideas about deviance, is a product of the culture we live in. This is another interactionist theory. This is bigger than just deviance, but this is how we could apply it to deviance. It's called social constructionism. This is sort of extreme relativity in some ways. I like this stuff, but that deviance is a product of the culture we live in, what is considered deviance. What social constructionist perspective put us on, if we're thinking about that deviance is always a product of the culture we live in, then we need to focus on the decision-making processes that create the deviant label and the deviant identity. This cartoon here is from about 3 years ago. There was riots in London. Next week, we're going to watch a film about what's going on the left. So you have bankers on the left sort of stealing a bunch of money from the U.S. Reserve, right? And we're going to see how that happened. Banks got bailed out by the federal money for engaging in criminal behavior. And they all kept their jobs. No one was arrested. But meanwhile, on the other side, in London, there was sort of, I guess you maybe would call it looting that went on. And the bankers are saying amateurs, right? Because these men are more likely to get arrested. No one has been arrested for stealing $6 billion from our economy. The point here is that what is the decision-making process? What are the structures that allow the bankers to not be seen as deviant and certainly not as criminal, and yet these people taking a TV as criminal? So we're going to focus on regulatory agents, police, probation officers, psychiatrists, judges, and teachers who play a significant role in creating the deviant identity by designating certain people as deviant and others as not deviant. We could think about... let's think about racial profiling, even in Arizona, where the purpose of racial profiling is often about illegal, trying to find people who are immigrating into this country. But how does profiling work, or even just stop and frisk? If we know that racial profiling exists, what is the mechanism by that works, right? People choose people based on the color of their skin, right? That what we're looking at here is that is telling us something about our culture, right? And our understanding of deviance. It is socially constructed. It is tied to, in this country, the culture of white supremacy, essentially. So we can look at another example. This is the same sort of thing, social constructionist and labeling theory put together. These are pictures were both taken after Katrina in 2005. And we see the young man above, they're doing the same thing, right? And yet the top one is labeled looting. The bottom is they're finding bread and soda. I don't know if you ever find things in a grocery store. You either, take it, buy it. But the question that interactionist theory lets us ask is, so what are the structures and the sort of social dynamics behind the decision to label the child at the top as a looter, a deviant? There's implications of deviance, and the bottom one, the couple here, as just finding things, not deviant, right? What's the difference between these two people? Obviously, it's the color of their skin, right? So this is telling us that something about the culture. We can learn something about the culture by looking at the way that these labels are applied, right? That culturally constructed ideas, right, around racial groups leads to the application of labels in different ways, right? It is socially constructed concepts about entire groups of people. So our third sort of school of theory, conflict theory, takes this a bit further, and it focuses specifically on the dynamics of power that are at work in applying labels. If you remember, conflict theory deals with issues of power and inequality. Conflict theorists argue that people with the power to protect their own interests, they define deviance to suit their needs. So how could we think about this? When we think about white-collar crime, we asked before, white-collar crime is not usually handled in the same way that other forms of crime are. Sometimes people aren't even arrested, but they're certainly not physically assaulted. In some ways, white-collar crime carries this not deviant label. It's you just got caught, right? Sometimes people are even looked up to, people who engage in white-collar crime. Certainly not the same way we would view people who are selling drugs on the corner, and like if we were to put it in the press, they'd probably be talked about differently, and yet they're kind of doing the same thing, just trying to get money. So conflict theorists then argue that the criminal justice systems serve the interests of the powerful. Those with the power protect their own interest and define deviance. They have this power, so they define deviance to suit their own needs. That lawmaking can be an attempt by the powerful to coerce others into their own idea of what is moral and what is immoral. We could think about those with power to define homosexuality as illegal, as it is in some countries, particularly in Africa currently. That the people with power in that society are creating law, right, to coerce everyone into their own moral system, which views homosexuality as an evil act. We can even look at victimless crimes. We have, which means usually property destruction. That tells us something about the value of property in our society. We value private property very, very heavily, especially people with a lot of it, rich people. They are in a position to label property destruction as a form of crime. We can imagine a society that doesn't have such a valuation of private property. Property destruction, victimless crimes wouldn't exist. So if there is different labeling and those with power are defining it in order to suit their own needs or protect themselves, then we shouldn't be surprised that what we find is a case of differential justice. That is, there are differences in the way that social control is exercised over different groups. So let's think about the example of sentencing guidelines for crack versus cocaine. Crack, on average, I think the number is sentencing for crack convictions is something like 7 times higher than it is for cocaine sentencing around the same crime involving cocaine, so being caught with X amount of it. Now, crack and cocaine chemically are the exact same thing, right? They're in different forms. They're in the exact same thing. But there's another big difference between crack versus cocaine, which is price. Crack is cheaper than cocaine. So cocaine is a drug that rich people tend to use, right? You have to have money to be able to afford cocaine. And crack tends to be used by people who are poor, right? So when we think about why is it that crack convictions are 7 times higher than the exact same drug, well, maybe the fact that cocaine tends to be used by people who are in positions with power to protect their own interests and to find deviance to suit their needs. Well, then we have a sort of definition of this same crime, right, that is different, and it affects different groups in different ways. There's a video I want you to watch. It's an Onion video. In case you don't know, The Onion is a satirical sort of news site. It publishes articles that are, they're not real, but they're meant to sort of like point out things, I guess, by being somewhat ironic. So why don't you watch that and then come back to here.
This is the Onion News Network, keeping you safe from the lies.
We begin tonight with an update on a story we've been following all week. Hannah Stevenson, the 16-year-old girl from Detroit, accused of stabbing a classmate to death with a screwdriver last month. At her arraignment this afternoon, Hannah received the harshest possible sentencing from the judge. She will be tried as a black adult.
Due to the extreme and violent nature of this crime, this court finds it fitting to try the defendant as an African American. Henceforth, you will be referred to for the jury by the name Contol Brown.
Once the trial begins next week, all courtroom images of Hannah will depict her as a 300-pound muscular black man, and jury members will be instructed to imagine her as such.
We're going to do our best to make sure that Hannah is treated with the sympathy and sensitivity that she, as a photogenic white girl, deserves.
This is America. Nobody deserves to be treated as a black man.
Now that Hannah has been ruled black, the court has instructed local media to assume she's guilty, and the police have retroactively charged her with assaulting her arresting officer. Hannah's 24 character witnesses have been replaced by a single crack addict who goes by the name of Skaggs. Hannah's parents are, of course, planning to appeal the ruling, saying that their daughter should at most be tried as a black celebrity or a stunningly beautiful Filipino lady. Every time I hear a story like that, it makes me so glad I'm exempt from the legal system.
All right, so that was trying to be funny, right? Why is the video sort of, what's the joke there? Is that we know that that young woman, if she's not treated as a white girl from the suburbs, right? We know that justice is going to be applied differently to those different people. That is sort of the underlying joke there. And if we look actually at the statistics, right, we see wild variations, right, in both the way that punishment is meted out, so sentencing, but even in just arresting rates, right? That people of color face higher rates of profiling and much higher arrest rates and much higher conviction rates than do whites, let alone rich. So if we look here, the likelihood of imprisonment, we carry them. For all men, it's 1 in 9. For white men, it's 1 in 17. White men are likely to face imprisonment, or it's 1 in 3 black men, right? 1 in 6 Latino men. These numbers are wildly different. And it gets even starker with women, right? White women are less likely than all women put together to be face imprisonment, right? But black women face 1 in 18, right? That's significantly higher, orders higher, multiples higher than it is for the other groups. So this, we know that this occurs, right? We know that this happens. So we can use these theories and these ideas to kind of walk back through the process and ask questions about, like, well, how did we get to this point, right? We have this outcome. How do we use sociology to analyze how it is this situation was created, right? Because again, we reject any biological arguments about deviance, that certain groups are more or less likely. There are social explanations for this. We go forward, and feminist theory actually has also given us some really great insights into thinking about. It's part of Marxist or conflict theory. When we think about crime, feminist thinkers have pointed out and highlighted how much of the way that we think about crime and deviance is actually centered on men. One example is that spousal rape has only relatively recently come to be recognized as a crime that's actually prosecuted, and that rape was defined as only occurring between non-married people. But, you know, spousal rape does happen, but this wasn't even registered as a crime, and it wasn't even possible to prosecute people, which meant that women who were raped by their husbands were sort of unable to make a case that that happened. It just wasn't possible. If we think about campus rape issues that are sort of been finally sort of getting some attention in the media that seems to have faded, and when we talk about in cases as the young men involved are very, very rarely prosecuted, and often culturally, like when we look in the press and in discussions of it, there are a lot of questions come up about what was she wearing or how was she acting at the party, right? As if the issue is that this woman is responsible for her own rape, that responsible for the crime, and that in fact the deviance is not on the rapist, but it's actually on the young woman for apparently, I guess, not acting in a way that prevented someone else's actions. But this is an example of what is sometimes called rape culture, that we sort of don't the ideas about deviance and crime are sort of built around men's positions of power in society. We can even think about things like abuse, right? That abuse of children or students by female teachers often goes unnoticed for a much longer period of time. Women are less likely to be seen as perpetrators in certain circumstances. So there's attitudes about women that exist that tend not to see them as potential perpetrators. That, for instance, again, abuse of children by female teachers. I've seen many articles when this is coming out, especially on, like, if you look on the comments section on, news organization sites, where the people, there's an idea that the male student is lucky, right? That because he's lucky to be having sex at that age, totally ignoring that this child has been abused, right? That we have culturally constructed ideas about gender and how it relates to deviance. So the last thing I just wanted to end on is talking about the reading briefly and total confinement, which is hard to do in a one-sided conversation. But I want to point out that the author, talked about how solitary confinement works, but there was this main idea about the irrationality of technically rational systems. When I think about what are some of the examples of the tight social control used in solitary confinement, and what are some of the negative effects of this control. The key question that comes out of this is the focus in these control units punishment, or is it to change the behavior or rehabilitate the person, as the prison system is, at least philosophically, aimed at doing? And what did it seem like the goal was in the reading? It seems like the goal tended to be punishment and not rehabilitation. And in fact, the tighter the control became, the problems often became worse. They made people worse. So if the goal is just simple punishment, right, and not actually punishment with an eye towards changing behavior, then some of these theories of deviance and crime seem to make more sense than others, particularly the interactionist and conflict ones. The idea of control units being, as the author described them, black boxes within black boxes, where the public can forget about what's happening, is clearly a situation that serves the interests of those in power, those who are deciding who goes inside. If we don't think about who's in there and why, then we don't have to question the socially accepted definitions of who is deviant and what is considered a deviant act. If they are sort of deeply hidden, then questions about is this why we put people in here? When, most U.S. prisoners are in there for nonviolent drug offenses. In polls of the public, people will say that these types of crimes shouldn't have prison punishments, right? So we poll them about nonviolent drug offenses. No, they shouldn't have prison sentences. But when we ask sort of questions in a different way, we ask about letting people out or about individual cases, nonviolent drug offenders, people tend to find some reason or say that they should stay. So we have a disparity here, that people say that the crime that these people are in for shouldn't have a prison sentence, but they also shouldn't be let out. So there's a disconnect there, right? And really what it speaks to is the power of certain groups to define deviance. Here, it's those are sort of in control of the carceral system, that it carries a deep sense of wrongness with it, that even though we don't think the crime should be punished in that way, there is sort of cultural ideas about, well, what people in there are like. And perhaps it's once we begin to widely question these sort of social definitions, we might find that people formerly deemed upstanding or model citizens are in fact some of the worst criminals this country's ever seen. And next week, we're going to learn about the economy and the political system, and we're going to watch a film, or at least part of a film, that is about the 2008-2009 financial collapse. And we're going to see how some of those bankers from the cartoon before willingly, knowingly, lied to the government and lied to their investors, and were stealing tons and tons of money. And when the banks almost collapsed because of it, our tax dollars were given to them to save them. But no one ever went to jail, not one person for this. So I want you to keep that in mind, this idea about sort of the power of certain groups to define both what is deviant and how deviance is handled.